Lock her up, Your Honor, my father spat. He slammed his heavy fists down on the solid oak table, striking the wood hard enough to rattle the water glasses and send a harsh echo through the room. That woman is a deranged junkie, completely unfit to control my mother's $10 million estate. I sat perfectly still in my charcoal suit, my hands neatly folded in my lap. The air in the courtroom felt completely frozen, suffocating everyone else, but I embraced the chill. My family thought they had finally cornered their prey. They believed this was the final snare in a trap they had spent 12 years building. Little did they know, they had just tried to con a federal fraud investigator. Thank you for watching this video. Before I take you back there, do me one small favor. Take a second to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. It helps more than you know. My name is Sloane Sterling, and I am 34 years old. For as long as I can remember, I was the designated scapegoat of the Sterling family empire. In my father's eyes, I was merely a shadow, a completely useless mistake standing in the background while my older sister, Fallon, wore the crown. Fallon was the golden child, the absolute center of his universe, a woman who never had to work a single day in her life because my father funded her every luxury. My father, Richard, was a prominent real estate developer in Chicago, a man who built his entire kingdom on a facade of immense wealth and staggering arrogance. His favorite phrase, the one he threw at me every time I failed to meet his impossible standards, was always the same. "You are nothing but a burden," he would sneer, his voice dripping with utter contempt. I spent my entire youth trying to earn a single drop of his affection. I worked myself to the bone, taking advanced classes, working late shifts at a diner to save up for my own college expenses, desperately hoping he would look at me the way he looked at Fallon. But the harder I tried, the colder he became. The absolute breaking point, the moment the mask completely slipped from my father's face, happened 12 years ago during a brutal Chicago winter. I was 22 years old, completely exhausted from working 3 minimum wage jobs to afford my university tuition. The sheer stress of surviving had broken my body down, and one night I collapsed. I was taken to the emergency room with a severe panic attack and sheer physical exhaustion. The doctor gave me a single prescription bottle of mild sedatives to help my heart rate stabilize. I brought them home to the small room I rented in my father's basement. He found the bottle. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask what had happened. He saw an opportunity. He marched down the stairs, his face twisted in a mask of sheer disgust, and dragged me out of my bed by my arm. He called me a pathetic addict. He screamed that I was bringing profound shame to his pristine family name. And then, he threw me out the front door into the freezing snow, wearing nothing but my pajamas and a thin coat. He locked the heavy wooden door behind me. He completely shattered my world in a single night. I slept in a subway station for 3 days, my body shivering, my spirit utterly broken. I believed I had lost everything because of my own weakness. Little did I know, the truth was far more sinister. I later learned that my father was secretly drowning in massive debt. His real estate empire was crumbling, and he was desperate for cash. Without telling anyone, he had illegally drained my entire college custodial account. He stole every single dollar my late grandfather had left me, using the money to finance Fallon's $300,000 country club wedding and to bail out a failing business venture owned by her new husband, Vance. My father needed a distraction. He needed a cover story to explain why my money was gone and why I was no longer in the house. So, he turned his own daughter into a junkie. He spread the lie to every aunt, uncle, and family friend. He told them I was a lost cause, a deranged addict who had run away to live on the streets. He painted himself as the tragic, heartbroken father. The entire family turned their backs on me. I was entirely alone, trapped in a cold world with no money and no name. But there was one person who refused to buy into his magnificent performance. My grandmother, Florence. Florence was the true matriarch of the family, a woman with a mind as sharp as a steel trap. She saw right through Richard's theatrical grief. While my father was busy toasting to Fallon's opulent wedding, Florence quietly hired a private investigator to find me. She found me working the night shift at a laundromat, living in a tiny, run-down apartment. She did not bring me back to the family. She knew that returning me to the wolves would only get me eaten alive. Instead, she sat me down at a worn laminate table and offered me a different path. She paid for my certification exams. She funded my master's degree in forensic accounting. She supported me while I underwent rigorous training to join the federal government. But her only condition was absolute secrecy. "Let them think you are a failure, Sloane," she told me, her frail hand gripping mine with immense strength. "Let them think you are nothing." That is exactly when a wolf survives. True power does not need to scream, it only needs to wait in the absolute silence. For 12 years, I remained a ghost. I let my father and my sister believe I was a completely worthless drifter who could not hold down a clerical job. I ignored their mocking text messages during the holidays. I ignored the sheer arrogance dripping from Fallon's social media posts as she paraded her designer bags and luxury vacations, all funded by Vance's incredibly shady private equity firm. I stayed in the shadows and I learned to hunt. I became a senior investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I spent my days tracking illicit money across the globe, dismantling massive laundering operations, and putting white-collar criminals behind federal bars. I became completely immune to deception. Then, 2 months ago, my grandmother Florence passed away. The grief was an immense, crushing weight on my chest, but I did not have time to mourn in peace. Upon her death, her final will and testament was unsealed. Florence had bypassed her son entirely. She left her entire $10 million estate, her properties, and her liquid assets directly to me, naming me the sole executor. When my father and Vance found out, their sheer panic was palpable. Vance's private equity firm was secretly collapsing under the weight of terrible investments, and my father's debts had finally caught up to him. They desperately needed that $10 million to avoid total financial ruin. They could not contest the will through normal means because Florence was completely of sound mind when she signed it. They needed to discredit me. They needed to prove that I was incompetent, a danger to myself, and legally unfit to manage the estate. So, they fell back on their favorite lie. They filed an emergency injunction in probate court to seize control of the assets, claiming I was in the final, catastrophic stages of a severe drug addiction. Which brings us right back to this freezing courtroom, where my father was pounding his fists on the table, demanding the judge lock me up. Fallon sat directly behind him in the gallery, performing her fake grief flawlessly. She dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue, leaning into Vance, who was wearing a suit that cost more than a car. "She is so sick, Daddy," Fallon whispered loudly enough for the court reporter to hear. "She needs to be in a facility, not managing a bank account." Their expensive lawyer stood up, smoothing his silk tie, and projected a massive file of medical records onto the courtroom monitors. They were admission forms and psychiatric evaluations from a facility called the Crestfall Recovery Institute. The documents detailed 30-day psychiatric holds, severe chemical dependency, and profound mental instability. The lawyer pushed a thick envelope of printed invoices toward the clerk. "The records are completely clear, Judge Mercer," the lawyer said smoothly. "My client's daughter requires immediate involuntary institutionalization, not a blank check to fund her dangerous habits." A heavy silence fell over the gallery. The few family members who had attended looked at me with absolute pity and disgust. They thought I was completely shattered. They thought my mask had been ripped off. I looked up at the projection screen. I did not look at the medical diagnoses. I looked at the billing format. I looked at the routing numbers at the bottom of the invoices. I felt a cold smile pull at the corner of my mouth. Judge Constance Mercer, a woman known for her absolute intolerance of nonsense, read the files in total silence. She flipped to page 4. She stared at the signature block. Then, she slowly lowered her reading glasses, leaned over the heavy mahogany bench, and locked her eyes directly on my father. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Mercer said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that cut through the room like a razor. "Are you absolutely certain you know what your daughter does for a living?" My father let out a harsh, arrogant bark of laughter. "She is a nobody, Your Honor. She is a clerical assistant who cannot keep an apartment for more than 6 months. She is completely useless." That was the mistake. That was the moment the trap snapped shut. I slowly stood up from my chair. I smoothed the wrinkles from my charcoal suit, picked up my heavy government-issued briefcase, and walked right to the center of the aisle. The sheer arrogance on my father's face began to falter just a fraction. I opened the briefcase. I did not pull out medical records. I pulled out my federal credentials and slapped my heavy gold badge onto the evidence table. "My name is Sloane Sterling," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, echoing like ice against the wooden walls. "I am a senior forensic auditor and federal fraud investigator with the United States Department of the Treasury." My father's jaw dropped. The lawyer literally froze, his hand hovering mid-air over his legal pad. Vance suddenly drained of all color, his face turning an ash gray as he stared at the gold seal on my badge. The entire facade was completely shattered. "Crestfall Recovery Institute is not a hospital," I stated clearly, turning my gaze directly to Vance, watching him shrink like cornered prey. "It is an unregistered shell corporation. It is a phantom entity created for the sole purpose of money laundering." I pulled a stack of subpoenaed financial records from my briefcase and handed them directly to the court clerk. The legal shift in the room was instantaneous. Over the past 48 hours, I have run the employer identification numbers listed on these fake medical invoices through the federal database. This shell corporation is registered to an offshore holding company managed entirely by my brother-in-law, Vance. He has been using this fake rehabilitation center to launder illicit investor funds to cover the massive, fraudulent losses in his collapsing private equity firm. The documents presented to this court today are not only absolute forgeries, they are the exact paper trail the federal government needed to secure an indictment. Fallon let out a breathless gasp, her fake tears instantly vanishing, replaced by absolute, sheer terror. "You didn't forge these documents to protect my grandmother's legacy," I said, turning to look my father right in his terrified eyes. "You forged them because she left me 100% of the $10 million, and you were desperate to steal it to save yourselves from federal prison. You handed me the smoking gun on a silver platter." Judge Mercer did not hesitate. The legal machinery slammed down with profound force. She immediately struck the injunction from the record. She issued an emergency order to freeze every single banking account, trust, and property deed tied to Vance's firm and my father's name. I am referring these forged affidavits and fraudulent filings directly to the United States Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution, Judge Mercer announced, striking her gavel with a sound like a gunshot. "Perjury and estate fraud are severe felonies, Mr. Sterling. You have made a grave miscalculation." At that exact moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. For federal agents, men I had called an hour before the hearing, walked down the aisle. Vance tried to stand up, his hands shaking violently, but an agent immediately secured his arms behind his back and confiscated his phone. Fallon began screaming, a horrible, ugly sound, as she realized her credit cards, her country club membership, and her entire lavish kingdom had just crumbled into dust. My father collapsed back into his chair. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a profound, terrifying realization. The daughter he had thrown into the freezing snow, the junkie he had used as a scapegoat, was the federal agent who had just signed his ruin. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt absolutely cold, and I felt completely free. 6 months later, I am sitting on the peaceful wrap-around porch of the beautiful estate my grandmother left me. I am drinking a hot cup of coffee, watching the morning sun rise over the property, completely at peace with the silence. Meanwhile, my family is facing a drastically different reality. Vance recently accepted a federal plea deal. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The moment the federal asset forfeiture stripped Vance of every dime he had, Fallon filed for divorce. She is now working a minimum wage retail job, living in a tiny rented room, completely cut off from the luxury she thought she was entitled to. As for my father, Richard, his massive real estate empire was completely liquidated to pay off his defrauded investors and massive tax liens. He is totally bankrupt, living in a subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city, waiting for his own criminal trial to begin. They tried everything in their power to lock the junkie up, but the junkie turned out to be the warden. I have my dignity, my completely restored name, and a profound sense of peace that absolutely none of their dirty money could ever buy. True justice is not about yelling the loudest. It is about letting the truth speak for itself when the time is perfectly right. Thank you so much for watching Sloane's story. What did you think of how she handled her father and sister? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice being served, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one. See you next time.